Alright, so here we are. I want to start with a little story about a guy named James Meredith. James Meredith was a civil rights hero who first came to national recognition in 1962 when he tried to enter the University of Mississippi as a student. The University of Mississippi at the time, like many schools across the country, especially the South, was segregated, meaning, of course, that it was a white-only university. Now, Meredith had been attending a black-only state university, but it was a far inferior school and had significantly less funding, and he wanted to go to University of Mississippi, which was the best school in the state. Caused lots of riots. His life was threatened several times, but ultimately he prevailed, and in 1963 he entered the University of Mississippi as a student. The following year, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This was sort of the major law that, well, if not end a lot of the racist policies that various states had, it at least sort of marked the beginning of the end of those policies. A few years after graduating, specifically in 1966, James Meredith decides to come back to Mississippi, and he announces that he is going to march and call this march the March Against Fear. Now, I realize this little button says March for Freedom, but that's another issue I'll talk about in a second. But initially, he's going to do this march called the March Against Fear, and he's going to do it alone. Traditionally, these civil rights marches involve lots of people, but he said, as an individual, he should have no fear against the death threats that he would receive, and so he would march from Memphis, Tennessee. And if you sort of look at the map here, if you look at that corner of Tennessee where it meets Arkansas and Mississippi, he would march there to Oxford, Mississippi, which is basically right in the middle of the state. That's a little over 200 miles. That's about the same distance as about Bellingham to Portland. Now, this was a march that was probably going to take about 2 weeks. Unfortunately, on the very first day of the march, James Meredith was shot. A sniper had been waiting in the bushes and shot him in the leg. This was to counteract the March Against Fear, to make sure that Meredith couldn't make a statement that this march would never happen. But of course, something did happen. Immediately after news spread that Meredith was shot, 3 major civil rights groups came down to Memphis to continue the march against fear in place of James Meredith. And that's when it then sort of the name changed and it became the March for Freedom. And the 3 organizations are these here: the SCLC, also known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and these were the pioneers of the civil rights movement. And this was, of course, led by Martin Luther King Jr. And so it's kind of a more established mainstream civil rights organization. The other 2 organizations were CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, led by Floyd McKissick, and SNCC, or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, at the time led by Stokely Carmichael. Now, like I said, the SCLC is the sort of older organization. CORE and SNCC, on the other hand, were made up of much younger people. In fact, you only need to think about the name SNCC. It's a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That means most of the people who are part of their organization were people in their late teens, early 20s. And here is a picture of Floyd McKissick, right, who at the time is probably in his mid-20s. And this age difference between the SCLC and the 2 younger organizations was not superficial. In fact, it was very significant and would greatly impact what would happen during this march. Now, here's a picture. On your left, you have the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and on your right, you have Stokely Carmichael, right? And again, there's a significant age difference here. and King represents the sort of more mainstream, what we might call moderate civil rights movement. Right? This is the movement of nonviolence. And so McKissick and Carmichael, the people from CORE and SNCC, were all very deferential to King. That is, again, they understood what King had achieved, and they greatly respected all that he had done. However, they also did not necessarily agree with his ideas. Right, and today we have this very romantic notion of King, this very kind of sanitized notion, memory of King, that he is, beloved in all ways, etc. And the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of people who genuinely did not like King, and I'm not talking about the redneck racists who were standing on the sides of the road and like these guys here, but within the black community, there were many who felt that King's methods simply did not work. And by 1966, there was a growing number of young African Americans who felt that this system, again, King's methods and this idea of nonviolence, was completely ineffectual. It would never really get the job done. So after about a little more than a week of marching, they are in Greenwood, Mississippi, where what normally happens is that again, you get hundreds and hundreds, and later on the number will grow up to thousands of marchers. It's hot. I mean, if you've ever been to the South, it is a sort of gross, sticky place to be. And so these people are very hot. They're uncomfortable. They're thirsty. They're hungry. And every night they would set up camp, and it was up to the leaders to try to rally the troops, right, to sort of to build morale. Near the end of the march, as the momentum grew, actually professional musicians flew in and would perform for these people, again, to sort of help the marchers keep their spirits up. And on this day in Greenwood, Mississippi, Stokely Carmichael takes it upon himself to again rally the troops, and he gets up to speak to a crowd of people. And this isn't actually him in Greenwood. This is just a kind of a stock photo of him speaking at a rally. But this is kind of what would be happening, and because there's no amplification system, he's just yelling, and something incredible happens here. It becomes the first known kind of popular chant of the phrase Black Power. Right? And here we have another picture of Stokely Carmichael at a different rally. This is probably in 71, or so this is a totally different thing here. But with this Black Power banner behind him. And it's sort of a symbolic shift, right? That we are now sort of leaving the old civil rights movement of nonviolence, of appeasement, of making compromises, to a kind of new militancy, a civil rights movement that is no longer, well, to put it bluntly, is no longer willing to sit back and wait for Whitey to, give it a break, give black folks a break, but instead a much more strident form of civil rights in which it's not about asking, but it's about demanding, right? And sometimes going so far as to simply taking. And of course, during this period is when we have the emergence of the Black Panther Party, and here sort of most famously is a picture of Angela Davis, who was a key figure during the civil rights movement. So you might be thinking now, well, okay, that's a fine story and whatever, but what does this have to do with any of the films we've watched? Well, to answer that question, let's go to the next section of the lecture.